So I'm going to demonstrate how to do edge to surface. And again, you want a larger piece and then a smaller piece. And if in case you didn't already do this, this piece should technically be and you do want to watch where your fingers are as you're trying to hammer things flat, just so that you don't accidentally really hurt yourself. Again, I took a steel block from over by the anvil table and I have a rawhide mallet to hammer flat. I don't want to actually mar the metal or dent the metal, and a metal hammer will actually make it thinner, and we don't want that right now. Part of the reason that I'm showing you how to do these different solders is, depending on what you make, you're going to have different connections between what you're doing, and it's important to know what to use in the booth as you're doing that. And you are going to have to problem solve even more, because sometimes even these solders aren't quite enough. There's even more versions of soldering that we have available to us. So once both pieces are flat, you're going to want to take the smaller piece and you want to actually file the edge of that piece. And I'm filing the smaller edge just so that it's a little bit easier for me to get this sample to solder. The larger that I have a piece, if I did my piece this way, it's going to take more heat to solder the piece together, and it's also going to take more solder. And since this is just practice, I'm going to use the smaller side. As I'm doing that, I also want to sand up halfway, and I can actually, you could, okay, so I'm going to take the smaller piece and I'm going to sand up half the way, and I want to make sure that I'm getting it completely sanded. And then I'm going to go on the other side. I just flipped it over. Whoa. I'm just going to hang on to this with this. This piece is actually fine, and notice I can actually pick it up with my fingers because I'm not touching the part that I sanded, so that part's still really clean. Again, I have to sand the surface of my piece of metal, because wherever I want to make a connection, I have to make it really, really clean. And then I'm going to hold with the other piece of sandpaper and sand the other half. And I don't need to sand both sides right now. I'm just going to sand where I'm soldering. When I want to clean it up later, that's when I would sand the entire piece. So I'm going to actually solder together my edge to surface piece. I'm going to take the piece that I have sanded and make sure that I put flux on both sides. And I can see I ran out of flux here a little bit, so I'm going to take a little bit more, put it in my lid. Eventually I am going to have to go and clean my lid out, and I will do that at the end just to make sure that I don't get stuff everywhere. You do have to be careful too, because if you have dirt inside, like right here, whoops, right here I can see there's a little piece of dirt. That would actually not allow my solder to work, so I want to make sure that I'm getting all of that dirt off of my piece, and I might even want to wipe my flux brush off so that that dirt is not anywhere near where I'm trying to solder. So I did both sides. I'm going to set that down. Then I'm going to pick up the smaller piece, flux that entire piece as well. And then I'm going to, if you notice, I have the third hand and a fire brick. And what I'm going to do is put my piece in the third hand. And I can see right now the third hand was a little bit open, so I put it back a little bit farther. What I could also do, and I'm actually going to do that because I don't like when it has to go way back here, I'm going to actually bend these hand parts back together so that I can go right on the edge of my piece. As we're all using these, that tends to happen, so you're going to probably have to sometimes bend that third hand back where it needs to go. And I'm also going to push this piece a little bit closer to the edge so that as I'm moving this around, I get a really nice connection. What I'm trying to do with this edge to surface right now is I'm trying to make a 90-degree angle on my piece of metal. So I have to make sure that they are completely touching with no space between the two of them. And right here I can see I got a little piece of dirt there, so I'm going to take that away. Then I'm going to take my flux brush and I'm going to pick up some of the pieces of solder that I already cut. And I'm actually going to put the pieces of solder on the back side back here, and I'll talk about why in just a second. So I took the pieces of solder and I'm going to push them right up next to where that seam is. So I actually went right in here, and they're touching actually where the seam is between this vertical piece and the piece that's flat. Now I'm going to move all of my things out of the booth. And I'm going to start soldering. Hopefully you noticed that I'm like sitting down. So I took a bench, or not a stool, and I'm actually gonna sit a little bit closer to this one, just because I wanna be able to see what I'm trying to solder. So again, I'm gonna make that feathery flame, and I'm just gonna heat this very slowly until that flux is bubbled up. The reason I stood up right now is I wanna make sure that that solder that I put on the back side doesn't pop off as I'm trying to get the flux to bubble up. And again, I have to do that very slowly. I'm going to turn this off just so that you can see. Actually, I should turn it back on. Sorry. Cut that out. I'm going very, very slow so that my solder doesn't come off of my piece. So here my whole piece is bubbled up. I'm going to change my flame to, again, that really large, like 4-inch flame, and I want to point it perpendicular down onto my piece, and I'm going to go in little circular motions, and I'm going to turn the light off so that you can actually see what happens. As I'm starting to do this, and when this metal starts to dance, I'll have you come over and look at this side, because the reason I put the solder on the back side is that when this gets hot enough, eventually I need to come over and focus my flame over on this side so that the solder comes all the way through. Again, solder is like glue with a piece, so we want to make sure that the solder goes all the way through a connection, not to make it so that it's weak. And it is going to take a little bit of time to get this hot, because this fire brick is sucking the heat away from that piece of metal. So we've got to get this hot enough to make it work. Oh, and there you saw my solder went all the way through. In order for me to quench this piece, I want to take a tweezers, and I'm going to open this up, and you can see it's stuck right now because it's still really hot. Like, I can actually pick up the entire fire brick. It started to cool off enough that I could let go of the third hand, and eventually in here it's going to let go of my piece. There we go. It cooled off enough that the flux sheared off. I still do need to go and quench this, and then I would pickle this and clean this up to make it look nice. One other thing that I wanted to talk about is we used brass for these first pieces. Brass, again, is the one that is golden colored, because it actually was easier for you to learn how to do the solders on brass. Brass is a little bit easier to solder. Brass and silver are easier to solder. Copper and nickel are harder to solder. That does not mean don't use them. It just means that if that's what you want, you have to be a little bit more patient and persevere through the fact that they're going to be a little bit tougher to solder. Part of the reason that nickel and copper are harder to solder is that they oxidize faster, so a lot of that fire scale will happen faster for you. You might have to add more flux onto the piece as you're trying to solder nickel and copper in order to make them work. Okay, so when you do your soldering samples, you want to make sure to actually take a stamp and actually stamp your initials into your piece of metal so that the teacher and you know they're yours, as well as your other students, because they all look the same. And so if you don't do that, somebody else could claim your piece. If you do tend to hand something in like that, technically, and it was somebody else's, obviously that's an academic integrity situation. So it's a good idea to stamp your initials into your pieces before you start them.